It's 1972. Richard Nixon is about to make history, and a young psychologist named Baruch Fischhoff has a question that's going to keep him busy for the next decade. Nixon is planning a diplomatic mission to China, an event so politically improbable that it has no precedent in the post-war era. The communist government in Beijing and the anti-communist government in Washington have not had formal relations since 1949, and Nixon, the career anti-communist, is flying to shake Mao Zedong's hand. Before the trip, Fischhoff asked a group of study participants to estimate the probability of 15 specific outcomes. Would Nixon meet with Mao? Would the United States establish a permanent diplomatic mission in Beijing? The participants wrote down their probability estimates, and Fischhoff sealed the results. Nixon flew to China in February 1972. The handshake happened. The diplomatic breakthrough happened. History was made in the full glare of international television coverage. Fischhoff went back to his participants afterward. He asked them to recall the probability estimates they had written down before the trip. Almost universally, participants remembered their pre-trip estimates as being higher than they actually were. Events that had occurred were misremembered as having been predicted with higher confidence. Events that had not occurred were misremembered as having been predicted to be unlikely. After learning the outcome, people could not accurately remember what they had thought before the outcome. Their memories had been quietly rewritten to make the outcome seem more foreseeable, more inevitable than it had actually appeared at the time. Fischhoff published these findings in 1975 in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance. He called the phenomenon hindsight bias. Informally, it's known as the "I knew it all along" effect. And it might be the single most consequential cognitive illusion you've never heard of. Picture a vast private library, floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old paper and dust, amber light from green-shaded desk lamps. Thousands of volumes, carefully ordered, apparently permanent. But every night, while you sleep, someone comes into the library and changes the books. Not dramatically. A sentence here, a probability estimate there. The phrase, "I suspected this might happen," quietly inserted into a passage that originally read, "I had no idea this was coming." The word surprising replaced with predictable. You wake up and everything looks the same. The books are on the shelves, your handwriting is in the margins, but the library has been subtly, systematically revised to make your past self look smarter than your past self actually was. This is what the brain does. This is hindsight bias. This is the library that rewrites itself while you sleep. An aerial view of Lower Manhattan in the autumn of 2008. Inside the glass towers, traders stare at screens the color of emergency. Lehman Brothers has just filed for the largest bankruptcy in American history. In the months and years that followed, a remarkable consensus emerged. Everywhere you turned, someone had seen it coming. Economists who had warned about subprime exposure, analysts who had flagged credit default swaps. The prediction market record tells a different story. Robert Shiller of Yale had been warning about irrational exuberance, and he was a genuine exception. But the broader professional consensus, as tracked by forecasting surveys right up to the eve of the crisis, showed no collective anticipation of systemic collapse. The IMF's 2007 Global Financial Stability Report described the global financial system as broadly resilient. Sophisticated risk models assigned negligible probability to the correlated collapses that actually occurred. After the fact, clarity everywhere. The bubble was obvious. The models were clearly flawed. The whole thing was a disaster waiting to happen. Nassim Nicholas Taleb is another genuine exception. He had argued in his 2007 book The Black Swan that rare extreme events were systematically underpriced. What's instructive about Taleb's case is exactly that he stood out. If the crisis had been as obviously foreseeable as hindsight suggests, Taleb wouldn't have been unusual at all. A wood-paneled room, 12 people around a long table, the particular exhaustion of a week in a courtroom. Medical malpractice lawsuits hinge on a question that seems simple. Did the doctor do what a reasonable physician would have done, given what was known at the time? The jury must evaluate the doctor's decision in the context of information available before the outcome. This is extremely difficult to do after the outcome is known. In a landmark study, Ruth Kaplan and colleagues found that physicians whose treatment decisions led to bad outcomes were judged significantly more harshly than physicians who made identical decisions under identical information when the outcome was good. The outcome itself, unknowable at the time of the decision, colored the jury's entire perception of whether the decision was reasonable. The legal system asks jurors to step back to the moment of decision and evaluate it as it appeared then. Hindsight bias makes that nearly impossible without explicit countermeasures. The brain keeps dragging the evaluation forward to where the outcome is visible and the judgment feels obvious. A surgeon in a Chicago courtroom makes a reasonable judgment call under genuine uncertainty. The patient dies. Months later, 12 people who know the outcome find it obviously negligent. The obviously is constructed retroactively. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes in Belgium are cold and silent under snow. Allied command is confident Germany is close to collapse. The war will be over by Christmas. On December 16th, Germany launches its last major offensive, a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes. 250,000 troops, 600 tanks. The offensive breaks through Allied lines and advances further west than any German push since 1940. The Battle of the Bulge is consistently described, in retrospect, as a failure of intelligence that should have been obvious. The warning signs were there: troop movements, signal intercepts, prisoner interrogations suggesting offensive preparation. In hindsight, the pieces fit together perfectly. What this analysis systematically ignores is the noise. In real time, the intelligence picture is filled with contradictory signals, false leads, and ambiguous data. The signal that predicted the bulge was surrounded by dozens of signals that predicted nothing, or predicted other things, or had previously predicted things that hadn't happened. The skill of the intelligence analyst is not to see the true signal after the event. It's to assign it adequate probability weight before the event, when it's swimming in a sea of noise. That skill is extremely hard to evaluate in hindsight, because hindsight makes the signal look obvious and the noise look ignorable. A desk in a home office, late evening. Financial statements spread across the surface. In a series of studies, researchers gave investors access to their own past predictions and asked them to recall what they had written. People systematically misremembered their past forecasts as being more accurate than they actually were. Ulrich Hoffridge and colleagues found that investors who had made specific market predictions showed statistically significant upward revision of their recalled confidence levels after learning the outcomes. They remembered being more certain about outcomes that occurred and less certain about outcomes that didn't. Neil Rose and Kathleen Voss published a comprehensive review in 2012 in Perspectives on Psychological Science, identifying 3 levels of hindsight bias: memory distortion, impressions of inevitability, and foreseeability judgments. These 3 levels compound. An investor misremembers being confident that a stock would rise. He concludes the outcome was inevitable given the fundamentals. He judges that he should have seen it coming. And from this chain of reconstructions, he draws a lesson. I was right because I'm good at this. The lesson his actual performance record might support is quite different. But the record has been quietly edited by the library that rewrites itself at night. A kitchen table, morning coffee, a conversation that started carefully and has been getting less careful for several minutes. Hindsight bias in personal relationships may be the most universal form of the phenomenon. After a relationship ends badly, the story of its ending is almost always told as a story of signs that were there from the beginning, warnings ignored, red flags rationalized away. The ending was always coming. The question is only why it took so long to see it. This reconstruction feels like self-understanding, and some of it genuinely is. But the clean narrative arc that hindsight constructs is almost certainly a distortion of what the relationship actually felt like while it was happening. Because while it was happening, the same person who produced the red flags also produced comfort and joy and moments of genuine connection that felt equally real. The narrative of "it was always going to fail" erases that complexity in favor of an arc that feels more coherent but is less true. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written about how the human mind is a story-making machine, constantly constructing narratives that impose causal order on the noise of experience. Hindsight bias is this tendency applied to the past, producing stories that are too clean, too linear, and too confident about causes and inevitability. In the 1980s, Philip Tetlock of Berkeley began one of the most ambitious research projects in political science. He recruited nearly 300 experts and asked them to make predictions about political and economic events over 20 years. He collected over 80,000 forecasts. The results, published in his 2005 book Expert Political Judgment, were devastating. Most experts performed barely better than chance. The most famous ones, frequent television guests, confident columnists, tended to perform worst of all. After outcomes became known, experts systematically misremembered their predictions as more accurate than they were. The same three mechanisms operated in full force: memory distortion, inevitability, and retroactive foreseeability. More troubling, the pattern produced a feedback loop. Experts who believed they had correctly predicted past events grew more confident in predicting future ones. Their track record, as they remembered it, supported confidence. Their track record, as Tetlock had actually recorded it, supported humility. This is the deepest structural problem with hindsight bias. It doesn't just distort the past, it damages the process by which experience is supposed to produce competence. If every outcome feels foreseeable in retrospect, experience generates overconfidence instead of accuracy. The expert learns, "I have good instincts," instead of, "I was wrong more than I thought." And her instincts get worse while she becomes more certain they're getting better. Tetlock's subsequent Good Judgment project identified a small group of genuinely skilled forecasters, super forecasters, distinguished not by domain expertise, but by epistemic habits. They broke down problems probabilistically. They sought disconfirming evidence. They updated beliefs with new data. And crucially, they kept accurate records and confronted discrepancies between predictions and outcomes. They fought hindsight bias directly by refusing to let the library rewrite itself. Why does hindsight bias exist? What purpose does it serve? Fischhoff proposed one answer. The bias protects the coherence of the self. To acknowledge that outcomes were genuinely unpredictable is to acknowledge that your decisions are made in fog rather than light. That's uncomfortable. It suggests helplessness the psyche resists. If outcomes feel predictable in retrospect, the world is an orderly place where careful people can navigate successfully. The brain generates this belief automatically, as a byproduct of how memory works. Rosa and Vos wrote that hindsight bias is cognitively efficient as well as ego-protective. A world of clear causal narratives is easier to navigate than a world of probabilistic uncertainty. The cost of this simplification, the distortion of the actual probabilistic texture of events, is invisible because it happens before the conscious mind can examine it. This is why hindsight bias is so hard to eliminate even when you know about it. The rewriting happens at the level of memory encoding, not conscious reasoning. By the time you're trying to remember what you thought before, the memory has already been revised. The original draft is gone. Hindsight bias is particularly devastating in contexts where learning from failure is critical. In medicine, aviation, military operations, financial risk management, the core learning mechanism is after-action review. Something went wrong. Let's examine the decision-making process and identify where it failed. But if hindsight bias operates in the review, the lessons will be distorted. Reviewers conclude the failure was more foreseeable than it was. They identify warning signs as obvious and attribute the failure to individual incompetence rather than systemic uncertainty. These lessons, pay more attention, use better judgment, are essentially useless. They don't improve the process because the process wasn't the problem. The problem was genuine uncertainty, which hindsight has erased from the record. Effective debriefing in aviation and medicine has developed specific countermeasures. The prospective hindsight method asks reviewers to reimagine themselves in the decision-maker's position before the outcome was known. Decision simulators recreate the information environment at the time of the critical choice. These techniques work, but require deliberate effort and institutional commitment. A desk, a notebook, a pen. The simplest possible technology for one of the most difficult cognitive tasks. The primary antidote to hindsight bias is records. Write down your predictions. Write them in enough detail to be testable. Write down your confidence level, not just, I think X will happen, but I think X has roughly a 70% chance. Date them. Seal them if you can. This is called a pre-mortem in organizational contexts. Before a decision is implemented, the team writes down what could go wrong, what the failure modes look like. The pre-mortem creates a record against which the actual outcome can be compared without distortion. Psychologist Gary Klein found that the pre-mortem technique improved teams' ability to anticipate problems by roughly 30%. More importantly, it created a document that survived the rewriting. The second antidote is base rate humility. The best calibrated forecasters, as Tetlock found, anchor predictions on historical base rates and resist constructing compelling narratives about why this case is different. Narratives are the enemy of calibration. A good story makes an outcome feel inevitable. A base rate keeps uncertainty visible. The third antidote is the adversarial collaborator, a term Kahneman uses for someone whose job is to challenge your reasoning from the opposite direction. In investment decisions, medical diagnoses, policy analysis, build in a voice actively looking for why you're wrong, not as a formality, but as a structural feature of the process. Back in the library. The shelves are the same. The amber light is the same. But there's something new. A table by the door. And on the table, a logbook. Every time you leave the library, you write down what you believe right now, before the night comes and the pages change. The logbook doesn't prevent the rewriting. Nothing prevents it. It happens below conscious access, in the mechanisms of memory consolidation. But the logbook creates an external record the internal rewriter cannot reach. A record that says, "This is what uncertainty actually felt like at this moment. This is what I didn't know. This is the fog I was navigating." And when you come back to it later, after the outcome, after the "I knew it all along" feeling has settled in, the logbook tells you a different story. Not the clean story the rewritten library tells. The real story, with all its uncertainty intact. That story is harder to read. It makes the world look less predictable, and yourself look less prescient than you'd like. But it's the only story that can actually teach you anything. The archive is rewriting itself right now. In your memory of last year's decisions, last year's predictions, last year's confident assessments that didn't pan out quite the way you expected, the library changes its books overnight. The question is only whether you left a note